Gananam tva ganapatigam havamahe kavim kaveenamupamashravastamam Jyeshtarajam brahmanam brahmanaspata anashrunvannutibhis seedasadanam Shri Mahaganadhipataye namaha Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Sadashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Now we will recite the Shanti Mantra, which is unique for the Mundakopanishad. I will just say, you can repeat. Om Bhadram Karne Vishrunuyama Devaha
Om Bhadram Karne Vishrunuyama Devaha
Bhadram Pashyemakshaviryajatraha
Bhadram Pashyemakshaviryajatraha
Sthirairangai Sastanubhihi
Sthirairangai Sushtuvagunsastanubhihi
Vyasema Devahitam Yadayuhu
Vyashema Devahitam Yadayuhu
Swasti na Indro Vruddhashravaha
Swasti na Indro Vruddhashravaha
Swasti nah Pusha Vishwavedaha
Swasti na Pusha Vishwavedaha
Swasti nastarkshyo Arishtanemihi
Swasti nastarksho Arishtanemihi
Swasti no Bruhaspatir Dadhatu
Swasti no Bruhaspatir Dadhatu
Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. I will explain this mantra later. Now, today we are starting a new Upanishad called Mundakopanishad. So far in the Advaita Academy series, we were fortunate to study 4 Upanishads, starting with Isha, then Katha, then Kena, and then Taittiriya. Taittiriya we recently completed. Now we are starting the 5th Upanishad named Mundakopanishad. Mundakopanishad is from the Atharvaveda. So far we did not study any Upanishad from Atharvaveda. So we will just have a small introduction to what this Upanishad is. And for a newcomer who has not heard any Upanishad so far, it is necessary to give some introduction to him about what an Upanishad is. For people who have already heard either from Advaita Academy or from any other teacher, introduction may not be needed, but for them it can be a sort of recapitulation. So you can put up with that. So we will have a small recapitulation of what an Upanishad is, what is its place in the entire gamut of the vast literature which we have, vast Vedic literature which we have, what is its importance, and then we will see and we will try to have a small idea about what this Upanishad is going to say. In this particular introductory session, I will try to give an idea of what an Upanishad is, and later what this Mundakopanishad is. So that is what we will do. Then about this Upanishad, if you can just recall, we have a vast mass of philosophical texts, philosophical religious texts. We have a vast mass. Unlike any other religion, we have got thousands and thousands of books. All are important for somebody or the other. So, but in the entire range of books, what are the most primary books and what are the not so primary books? That we have to have a very, very clear idea. Unless we have such an idea, suppose you go to a bookstall, you will find hundreds of books, all seem to be equally important, some Purana, Agni Purana, some other Shiva Purana, some other Brahma Vishnu Purana, and so many things, and then some Lalita Sahasra, and then some Vishnu Sahasranama. So many things you will find, and you do not know what is representative of the Indian heritage. What is the most unique thing? What is the most representative element of our Indian philosophical heritage, philosophical system, the knowledge system, if we say. So that we have to see. So first of all, we have to see that the Vedas, they were the oldest documents and they are the most primary sources. For all other things they have just flown, flown from them only. From Vedas only, all other things have flown or grown, whatever you can say. So the Vedas are the most primary text, followed by other things like Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc., etc. So Vedas, we call them as the most primary texts. And in this Vedas again, we make a small clarification, classification. Vedas, they cover the whole gamut of human activity. because in those days when the rishis, when they gave us the Vedas, it is not composed by one rishi. We have to remember that they were all compositions by various rishis. I am saying the word, I am using the word composition, but the very, very traditional people may not like it, because the composition, they say that it is something which is apaurushaya, which has come from the Brahma as a nishvasa, brahmanaha nishvasitameva rigvedaha, etc. So it is something which has come out like the very breath of the Lord, the Creator. So something like that. But anyway, even if you accept the most modern idea and most modern view, the Vedas are the oldest documents. In fact, the Rig Veda is acknowledged as the oldest document of humankind. And then followed by other Vedas, Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda and Atharvaveda. So it has come like that. And the Vedas, as I was saying, they cover the whole range of human activity, because the people have to be kept busy. People in any society, they have to be kept busy and in a fruitful way. They have to be kept busy in a fruitful, useful, disciplined way. So the Vedas, they chalk out various rules and regulations. You do this, you do this, you do this. So they have, on various occasions, we have got so many festivals. Now for so many reasons, we have got so many yajnas, etc. Yajna, maybe it is associated with some fire sacrifice, or it may not be associated with that. So various activities, some vratam you have to do in your house, and then you have to feed so many people. Say in a particular vratam you may have to feed 10 people, and another vratam you may have to feed 100 people. So it is like that. So the Vedas, they keep the human being busy by chalking out a list of do's and don'ts. So that is the first, in fact, that constitutes the first portion, the beginning portion of the Veda. But then, a man cannot be kept at that level only. Every morning getting up and then doing some prayers, and then again going back, again evening doing some prayers, and then half a dozen times prayers and whatnot. It is not the aim. The human being has to be guided to a higher level of thinking about what is the ultimate reality, what is the supreme reality. So to that extent it has to lead. So the Vedas, from this portions which deal with the karma or activity. The karma is a technical word in Vedanta, we know that. And that karma means human activity. Human activity which is oriented towards the welfare of, say, the rest of the society is, strictly speaking, that is what is karma. Not our personal activities like just coming to an office, sipping coffee, sleeping, drinking. These are not works. Work means something which is having an interface with another person, which is affecting the society. So these are which are influencing the society, our contribution to society, so such things. So anyway, from that level, the Vedas have to lead a person to a higher level called thinking or realization about what is my real nature. So from that point of view, Vedas are divided usually into two levels, what is called karma, and then again say Vedanta, Upanishad, Karma Kanda, Jnana Kanda it is called. Jnana means knowledge. So Karma Kanda and Jnana Kanda. Sometimes it is also divided in the middle. Sometimes we also call it a Upasana Kanda, a sort of transition from karma to Jnana. There is another small section called Upasana Kanda, where meditations are prescribed. Initially, basically physical karma. And after that, there is some upasana, means a meditation. Meditation is a mental activity. For the first time, the mind also, he has to put his mind and think about the nature of the deity whom he is worshipping, etc. So from that level, he goes to the level of thinking, speculation, contemplation. So these three levels. Sometimes the Vedas are divided into two, that is Karma Kanda and Jnana Kanda. From some other point of view, sometimes they also divide into three, that is Karma Kanda, Upasana Kanda and Jnana Kanda. In whatever manner you divide, it doesn't matter much. Upasanas, they constitute a very important means of transition from mere ritualistic position to the position of Jnana. So this is what we have to see. So coming back to our question of what are the primary books and what are the secondary sources or secondary books, we have seen that Vedas are the primary things. And in that Veda, not the preliminary portions of the Veda dealing with the work, all the works means the karma related thing, not that, but the knowledge portions of the Vedas, they are the ultimate, the final positions of the Vedas. They are the last chapters of the Vedas. So that is why they are called Veda Anta. Anta means end. Vedanta means the end portions of the Veda. Or in other words, we can also say, take it as the last word of Vedas. You see, you have told 100 things, and at the end you give a final advice to your son. So you tell so many things, and then at the end you give a final advice. So that is the final advice. So the final advice or the final word of the Veda is Vedanta. It is otherwise called Upanishad. Upanishad, it has got a meaning also. Upanishad, it is constituted of, it can be broken into 3 sections, that is Upa, Ni and Sad. Sad is the root dhatu as we call it in Sanskrit. Upa and Ni are the prefixes. Upa means near. Ni is Nishchayena, surely, assuredly. Then Sad dhatu, it gives 3 meanings. It is used in 3 senses. That is Visharana Gati Avasadhaneshu, which means that is it weakens. It is used in the sense of weakening something. And Gati means attaining something. And Avasadhana means destroying something. So that is, number 1 is weakening, number 2 is attaining, number 3 is destroying. In all the 3 senses, this word Sad, this root Sad is used. And Shankaracharya has applied this, this word in all the 3 senses. Sad, he has used it in all the 3 senses, and he said, Sad, what is it weakening? Visharana. Visharana means weakening. What is it weakening? Knowledge of the Upanishads weakens something. Knowledge of the Upanishad makes you attain something. Knowledge of the Upanishad destroys something. So in all the 3 senses, Shankaracharya has used this word Upanishad. So what is it is going to weaken? It is going to weaken our sense of attachment, our bondage with the world. So otherwise we are very strongly bound. We are very, very strongly bound. We are totally so fully bound. Like some French writer said, man is born free, but everywhere he is bound in chains. So it is like that. It is a statement straight from Upanishads, we can say. It is almost straight from Upanishads. So man, he feels that he is bound everywhere. And this knowledge of the Upanishad, it weakens that particular sense of bondage. It weakens and makes your mind ready, prepares your mind for a higher study. So that is what it does. Then attaining, in the sense of attaining. And what is it is going to attain? It is going to attain or realize what is your real nature. Realize your real nature. Realize that you are not different from that supreme reality, that supreme thing, as we call it, supreme entity. You are essentially the same as that supreme reality. So that is what it is going to say. It is not so easy. We can say it in a class so easily, but then it requires a lot of contemplation, meditation, and then bringing it to our own experience. So that is more important. Then the third meaning of the root Sad is Avasadhana, means destruction. What is it that it is destroying? It is destroying our ignorance. What is ignorance? Ignorance means the sense of false identification with the body-mind complex, the sense of bondage which we have to all the beings, which are all the things which are around us, all the so-called my family, my say religion, my caste, my social identity, this, that, etc. All as a big identity which is built up around us, that whole identity has to be destroyed. So that destruction takes place by the knowledge of the Upanishad. So if we are afraid of if we are afraid of any such destruction, we should not listen to Upanishad. But then the very fact that we are trying to know what this Upanishad is, it means that we have reached a particular level of maturity and we are prepared to listen to, say, this thing, and at the risk of, say, losing our social identity. So that is it. Not that you will become totally ineffective or anything like that. It frees you. Basically, it gives us freedom. It gives us freedom, not that you tear away your passport or visa, and then not that you tear away your identity card, social identity, not like that. It gives you a lot of freedom. You will have all that, but you will not identify with them, you will not cling on to them. So that sort of fearlessness, that sort of courage, the knowledge of Upanishad gives. So in all these 3 senses, the word Upanishad is used. So this, coming back to this Upanishad, how is it related to religion? The next question is, how is this Upanishad related to religion? Is it something to do with religion, or is it something which is something different from religion? So we can see that it is somewhat related to religion in the sense that Upanishads have influenced our religion. Upanishads have influenced our religion, and Upanishads also have validated certain beliefs. Upanishad is not a belief system. A religion is a belief system, isn't it? A religion says, okay, some prophet or somebody comes and then he says, okay, I had some interaction with God or God's messenger. Okay, this is what is revealed to me, and this is something which is uniquely revealed to only one man and nobody else. And then that revelation he says, okay, this is what is God, this is what is heaven, this is what is the devil, this is what is this thing. And then you have to worship this only. The God has told me that we have to convert the whole world into this. So that is what is religion. That is belief. Upanishad is not a belief system, because all these rishis who have given us all these Upanishads or the earlier portions called Vedas, they had no agenda to establish an organized religion where there is a personal God. Personal God means somebody who is having certain characteristics, somebody who is commanding, somebody who is rewarding the good and punishing the bad, somebody who is saying, okay, you do this, and then somebody who is interacting with people, somebody who is dispensing so much justice to people. So that is a personal God. Upanishads, they don't speak at that level. Upanishads, they try to know what is the supreme reality. What is the supreme reality? And religion is something which is dogmatic. It says, yes, this is what it is, you have to believe. Upanishad doesn't believe. Upanishads, it is a question of, contemplation. If we recall what we have seen in Taittiriya Upanishad, it says, Tapasa Brahma Vijijñāsasva. A son goes to the father and he requests the father, okay, oh father, you please tell me what is the supreme reality. And the father says, Tapasa Brahma Vijijñāsasva. And your mind is your own laboratory. Your mind and the senses, they are your tools. Your body-mind complex, that is the tool which you are having. And with the help of that, you have to discover. You have to see what is behind it. So from that point of view, he tries to seek what exactly it is. Am I the body? Am I the prana or the vital force which is there, which is giving that kriya shakti or energy to me? Or am I merely the mind? Or am I something slightly, mind also functions at different levels, mind, buddhi, ahankara, etc. So am I that? Or what is my real nature? So from that point of view, he goes on to explore the real nature. So there is no question of belief system. It is a question of pure understanding, realization. But at the same time, Upanishads also accept certain things which are also accepted in religion, like karma. The principle of karma, the doctrine of karma, in the sense that whatever action you do, that gives you some, like the Newton's law, it gives a karma phala, and you have to jolly well have that karma phala. And when we go through the text, I will explain it more elaborately what exactly is our doctrine of karma, because we need not discuss all those things right now. So karma is something, you are yourself a product of that karma, the previous karmas and previous lives, etc. Otherwise, we will be saying that God has created in a very, very arbitrary way. God has created somebody rich and somebody poor, somebody healthy, somebody lame. We will be attributing that sort of injudicious, method in creation. God cannot be so injudicious, isn't it? So that is one reason, that is one important reason why this karma is accepted, because you are responsible for your own action. Okay, now that you are born in a particular way, it may be the product of your karma, but at the same time, your destiny is now in your hands. Your destiny is in your hands, you are free to choose your action. So this is a mixture of, you may be a product of your past karma, but then you have got all the freedom to choose, you have got all the freedom to go to a higher level, you have got all the freedom to discover yourself. So do whatever you want, good, bad, ugly, whatever you want, you are free to do. So that is what is karma doctrine. Karma doctrine is not fatalism. That is one thing which we have to see. It is not fatalism. Fatalism means, okay, this is my fate, I have to bear it. It is very, very wrongly. Some of our people also, in Hindus also, they don't have a clear idea about what exactly is this karma. They think, oh, it is my fate, I have to bear it. It's not like that. Something may happen that may be a product of the previous karma, that is a totally different thing. But you have got the ability to change it. You have got the ability to make your own destiny. So that is what we see. So this Upanishad combines philosophy with, this is the only belief which, if we can see, this is the only thing which this Upanishads, they accept, this karma theory, because it is good for, basically it is, there is no other way to explain. It is also, the reason is, there is no other way to explain this diversity in creation. As I said, the inequalities in creation. Inequalities cannot be explained otherwise. So this is the only way you can explain the inequalities. So this is one thing which we see about, the Upanishads. The methodology is pure contemplation, thinking, a rational approach to reality. So then, what is the type of God which Upanishads are, postulating? Is it the type of some God who is sitting in a heaven? There is some place called heaven, and in that high pedestal, some golden throne studded with the jewels and diamonds and all that, is he sitting there? Or what is our concept of God? Upanishad says it does not use the word called God or anything like that. Of course, God also, it can be used, there is nothing wrong with that word. Upanishads, they say that the so-called supreme reality is not a person. It is not a person. It is an entity called pure consciousness only. This is one important thing we have to recall or remember. So if you are a totally newcomer, you will realize, you will have to remember that from the point of view of Upanishads or from the point of view of the Vedas, the ultimate reality or the supreme reality or the highest thing called God is not a person but an entity called consciousness. And this consciousness has got the ability to manifest in so many different ways. And the ability to manifest is a sort of interface called Maya or Prakriti, whatever it is. This consciousness is manifesting as matter. The crux of philosophy, the essential teaching of philosophy, the essential teaching of Vedanta is that there is only one entity, that non-dual. Advaita, when you say Advaita, na plus Dvaita. Dvaita means duality. Na plus Dvaita. Advaita means non-duality. So there are no two things. Right from times immemorial, the Indian philosophers struggled with this idea called this consciousness and matter. This consciousness, is it, is it the only thing existing, or is matter also is existing? And the materialists, the earlier materialists, they said from matter only intelligence comes. Is intelligence coming from the matter? Or is intelligence first and then intelligence is appearing as matter, intelligence is manifesting as matter? So this has been the question which has been engaging the attention of all the philosophers. Vedanta. And Advaita says it is only one thing called consciousness. Consciousness which is existing, at the same time existing and pervading all. That is consciousness infinitely pervading. An infinitely existing consciousness. That is how the supreme reality has been defined. So this definition is from the Taittiriya Upanishad, if you recall. Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahma. Satyam is existence, Jnanam is consciousness, Anantam is infinity or infinitude, whatever you say. So infinitely existing consciousness is something which is the supreme reality, and we have to give some sort of word to that. We have to, after all, we need a word to explain it. So the word used is Brahma, B-R-A-H-M-A, Brahma. In English, while writing in English, somehow that N, Brahman, it has also come, Brahman. We call it Brahman. In Sanskrit, we only write Brahma. And there is another word called Brahma. In Sanskrit, there are two words called Brahma and Brahma. If you have heard the shloka, Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So in the first line, Gurur Brahma, that elongation of A is there, Brahma, that A is elongation is there. In the second line, Guru Sakshat Param Brahma, that short Brahma. The first thing is Brahma. So there is a difference which we have to see between this Brahma and Brahma. Brahma is what we have just called the infinitely existing consciousness is Brahma. Then who is this Brahma? Brahma refers to the creator. So the first thing we have to remember in Vedanta is the difference between Brahma and Brahma. Brahma is the creator. Where from this creator has come? So the same manifesting power in this supreme consciousness is called that creator, Brahma. The manifesting power, otherwise called Maya, Maya Vachinnam Chaitanyam, that Chaitanya, that consciousness which is associated with this, say this interface called Maya, is called, say Ishvara or Srushtikarta or Brahma, in whatever manner you say Brahma, it is said. So this is an entity. This is not a person, this is not a personal God, but this is an entity. So that is why it is called, say it is not referred to as a he or she. Normally in religion you refer to it as he or she. In India we have got goddesses also. So we say supreme goddess is some Lalita, supreme goddess is Durga, supreme goddess is Lakshmi, something like that we say. But here when you come to Vedanta, you don't either call it he or she, we call it it. So that is one thing which we have to remember. Then another word which is useful here is Nirguna. Nirguna and Saguna. So there are two categories called in which you can see the supreme reality. The supreme reality which is of the nature of just consciousness, existing, infinitely existing consciousness. This cannot be the God in the ordinary sense of the word, who is doing this, rewarding the good and punishing the bad and whatnot, all that management of the world, and then super cop, being a super cop for the universe and all that. That is not the function. So this is something which has no function, which has no shape, no name, shape or anything, no function. So that is why it is called Nirguna. So this Nirguna level. And then when it comes to Saguna, in this Saguna means at the level of religion. In all religions there is a God. There is a God who is the creator, the person who is rewarding all the good people, the person who is controlling the universe, the person who is maintaining the sort of law and order, the cosmic cop. So this cosmic cop is somebody who is a Saguna. And this cosmic cop may have a body, may not have a body. For example, the Western religions, they say, no, our God doesn't have a body, whatever it is. Even so, even if it is so, he is continuously interacting. You accept that he is a male. Christianity doesn't say that the God is a female. They say it is only a white male, white male and some elderly man. So Jehovah, whatever, Jehovah. So at the level of religion, they talk about a person, a personal God. He may or may not be having a form. But it is a personal God and a Saguna level. Saguna means having the attributes like this creation, sustenance, destruction and things like that. All these things will be there. But in Nirguna Brahma, it is not there. Nirguna Brahma is Shuddha Chaitanya, in which Shuddha Chaitanya means pure consciousness, in which all these things they are manifested. So that is one thing which we have to see. Then coming to say the Upanishads in general, what is it that we learn in the Upanishads? You see, Upanishads, they tell about what is the nature of a jiva. Jiva means the individual. Jiva means any living being is a jiva. Any being, any thinking being is a jiva. Starting from an insect. Why insect? Starting from a microbe. Some sort of organism in our stomach, some microbe. Starting from bacteria, right up to the biggest giant or biggest dinosaur. All these things are jivas. The plants, they are also jiva. So all these things, jiva, what is the nature of the jiva and what is the nature of the srushti, how this creation has taken place. Usually in all major Upanishads we find these three, four things. What? The nature of the jiva, the nature of the jagat or universe, how it is created, etc. And then the nature of the supreme reality. What is the nature of that? It describes each Upanishad. It has its own way of describing, but ultimately the summary, sum and substance is same. Sum and substance is, it is something which is of the nature of consciousness. It is something which doesn't have a name or form. It is something which is beyond our senses. It is something which is behind our senses. It is beyond, totally beyond our senses. So these are the things, descriptions. It is a pure entity called consciousness. That is what is the sum and substance of all the Upanishads. So it tells about the nature of the supreme reality. Then how to realize it? If that is so, how to realize it? What is the sadhana or effort? There is a word called sadhana. Sadhana means effort. The seeker has to make some effort to do that, to achieve it or realize it. What are the efforts which you have to make? So that is one thing. That is one aspect which we see. And having realized what is the benefit a person has got. You see, going to a place called heaven and sitting there, and what is the difference between heaven, which is described by the religion, and what is this moksha realization, which is described in Vedanta. So this is another important thing which we have to note. The difference between heaven and, say, realization. Heaven means there is something which is unseen by anybody. It is something which is promised in a religion by a religious prophet, and it is a question of belief system. Heaven is, okay, Christians they say one type of heaven, Islam can say another type of heaven, Hindus can say different types of heavens. For example, Krishna, if you are a believer of Krishna, you will go to Goloka. If you are a believer of Shiva, you will go to Kailasa. If you are thinking about pure Vishnu and not the avatars, you will go to Vaikuntha. So like that, Brahma, Satya Loka. So like that, different lokas, different worlds, they are different heavens, as we say. And the different heavens, they have got their own facilities, they have got their own, pleasures and all these things. Mostly all these heavenly worlds are full of pleasures. So in Devendra, if you go to Indraloka, this is a purely the higher version of our casinos or pubs, where you find all dancing and things like that, all merrymaking, all those things will be there in Indra's heaven. So Indra's heaven is different from Vishnu's heaven, so and it is different from Shiva's heaven. So Shiva's heaven, they will be doing some tapas and they are more austere and things like that. So like that, different types of heavens you can find in, say, Hinduism. So this is at the level of belief. Whereas here in Vedanta, we are not talking about any heaven. There is no question of this jiva going to a heaven. When you go to heaven, according to religion, what do they promise? Suppose you are in a particular say religion, and that particular religion says, okay, if you kill some people who don't belong to this religion, you are promised some damsels in heaven. So that fellow, he really thinks that he is there, he is going to get those damsels in heaven. So that is, and then he is impelled by that sort of persuasion. And then, in fact, they also give a lock to him, they key to him to open the lock of that heaven and then enter the heaven. So like that, so such things are also there. So which means it is at the level of, the personal identity is very much there in heaven. You see, in heaven, you are going to heaven with a subtle body. You may not go to heaven with the same physical body, because the physical body is dropped, everybody is seeing. To whatever religion you belong, the dead body is here only. So some sort of subtle body goes to heaven, let us say. Some subtle form, it goes to heaven. So that notion of I, that your personality has not disappeared. The body has gone, but the personality has not disappeared, even in that loka. But here, when you come to realization, your personality is no longer there. You are just merging in that infinite consciousness. Like a wave, the example given is like that of a wave and an ocean. A wave, by virtue of its peculiar formation, initially it may think that it is something which is independent of the ocean. But the wave, on realization, it finds that it is not different from the ocean, it is ocean. It is not part of the ocean, it is the ocean. So like that, the sadhaka or the seeker, he realizes that he is of the nature of infinite consciousness. That supreme reality called consciousness is not different from him. In fact, he is that. So that is what the Upanishads say, that you are, that thou art, tattvamasi, or aham brahmasmi means I am that. There are very famous books called I am that by Nisargadatta Maharaj's teachings. It is one of the wonderful books, a wonderful book which everyone has to read, I am that. It clarifies so many points in such a very, very lucid way. So anyway, so this is the realization. The benefit, the ultimate result of realization is that your personality is not there. In heaven your personality is there. Your personality is intact, your ambitions, your greed and your desire to have more and more damsels, all those things are there. But here all those things are gone. Here, say, you are realizing that you are No, you are part and parcel of the, not even part and parcel, you are the macrocosm. The microcosm as this individual thing. It is a manifestation of that macrocosm only. And then the consciousness which is reflecting in your intellect is the same consciousness which is the supreme consciousness. This sort of realization where you lose your personality, you lose your identity. You may be acting in the society. You may be a very efficient king, like King Janaka. You see, we should realize that this knowledge makes us unfit for the world. It is not so. It is not that this knowledge makes a person unfit for the world. It makes him a better person. If you read Gita, if you recall the Gita's lines, it makes him a better person. Yoga karmasu kaushalam. It makes him more competent, more efficient, because you distance yourself. You distance yourself from your activities, and then you look at all your activities in a proper way. You put them all in perspective. Like King Janaka, if you see in Bhagavad Gita, he is a ruler. He is a ruler, but at the same time he is a jnani. That is why he is called a Rajarshi. Rajanashyate Rushayascha. That is the Bhashyam. So he is a king and a wise man. Wise man means he is a realized person. He is a realized person. So that is the difference which we see. So this knowledge of Upanishads or knowledge of Vedanta does not make us unfit for the world. But on the other hand, it makes us fitter. You are in a better position to do your work with a greater equanimity. So that is one thing which we see. Now we will come to this Mundaka Upanishad. This Mundaka Upanishad, what exactly is this Mundaka Upanishad, and what is it we have to see in this? What are the specialities, what are the things which we see in this? The word Mundaka, you see Mundanam, you must be knowing the meaning of Mundanam. You go to Tirupati and then you shave off the head. That is called Mundan. Almost all Hindus, we know the word Mundanam. Mundanam is shaving off the head. Mundaka, it has got two meanings. One is, it is the razor, the barber's razor which actually shaves the head. It also means, Mundaka also means a shaven head. Shaven head means usually the sannyasis, all these mendicants, the monks, etc., who shave off their head and then who go about. So this shaving of head in a temple, what does it signify? Shaving of head in a temple, what does it signify? Till that time you are grooming you are doing all types of hair care, and then you are grooming the hair in wonderful way. You are proud of your hairstyle and all that, and then you go and sacrifice, give your hair. It means that to some extent you are bowing before that Lord, and then you are trying to subdue yourself. You are trying to subdue yourself. You are trying to lose some amount of the so-called I notion, the so-called pride. You are preparing to sacrifice some little bit of I in the presence of that deity. So that is what is the meaning of shaving off the head in a temple. So suppose you you secure a pass in an examination. The students, they go, they give their hair there. So that means you are not bothered about your beauty or handsomeness, and then you are sacrificing something there. To some extent you are subduing yourself. So that is what is Mundanam. But here again Mundanam means, it is a sort of metaphorical thing. You have to clean your head. Basically Mundanam is physical cleaning, but Mundanam in a metaphorical sense, in this sense, is cleaning your head. Cleaning your head means removing all the impurities from the head. The head has so many impurities. Head means the mind has so many impurities. So many impurities means, for a normal man, all these impurities may be there. A normal man, he is having his own likes, dislikes, raga, dvesha as we call them. He is having his own prejudices. He is having his own, notions about things. So all these things he is having. But when you come to this level of a seeker, when we try to know what is our real self, so when you come to the level of a seeker, then a seeker should have a clean mind. Unless he has a clean mind, he will not be able to understand. You will not be able to understand philosophy doing 100-odd things. You are doing some speculation in the stock market. You are doing some other thing, investing money somewhere. You are very busy making money, and then you are worried about your various other things. And then incidentally you want to know about Vedanta, and incidentally you want to know about this Maya and Brahma and whatnot. That is something which is incompatible. So we have to free our mind from all these things to some extent. In fact, that is what yoga also says, that is what Vedanta also says. Yoga means I am talking about the Patanjali yoga system. Patanjali yoga, though it is not identical with Vedanta, it has got a lot of similarity with Vedanta. So Patanjali yoga, it talks about the 8-limbed yoga, the Ashtanga yoga it talks about. And then all these things are step by step, say purification of the self, purification of all our chitta malam, as it is called. Chitta malam means the impurities of the mind. So similarly in Vedanta, there are certain prerequisites. There are certain prerequisites in the sense that the mind has to be free. The mind has to be made pure. And the example given is that of a lake. Suppose you want to catch the reflection of, say, the sun on a lake. Sun or moon, whatever it is. The lake waters should not be, say, moving. It should not be turbulent. And at the same time, water also should be clean. The water should be clean and it should not be turbulent. That is, on one hand, it needs a purity, and again it needs tranquility. Purity and tranquility. In Sanskrit we say it, nirmalatvam and nischalatvam. That purity and tranquility of mind is needed in order to have that image of Brahman in our mind. So that is why a scientist may not need a purity of mind. For example, a scientist, he is doing some great experiment. Suppose he is engaged in a very big, say, research activity. He may not need the purity of mind because he may have his own prejudices, he may have his own, not prejudices about the subject, he may have his own personal likes, dislikes for various things. He may have enmity with somebody else, he may be trying to prepare an atom bomb in order to destroy the world, but his focus is on that particular thing. But that particular, say, work which he is doing. But here, the focus is on yourself. The Vedanta, you are not observing the external world. A scientist is observing the external world, making use of the external world for his benefit. Whereas Vedanta, you are observing the observer. You are trying to see your own nature. You are the observer. What is my nature? So that is why you always come across words like, say, observer, drashta, Sakshi. Sakshi is a witness. Then Kshetrajna, the person who knows the Kshetra, the person who knows the field, as we call it, that means somebody who is the observer. So you are the observer. You distance yourself. So that is it. So there that you-ness also disappears. That once you distance yourself, that you-ness also disappears. So anyway, here that purity of mind is needed. So that is what is very essential in these Upanishads. That is the meaning of this Mundakopanishad. It doesn't mean that this Upanishad is only for sannyasis. It is not for monks. In fact, we see that this Upanishad actually is told to a Grihastha only. Actually, Mahashalaha. When you see this mantra, it is actually told to a Grihastha, and not to Grihastha means a family man. A Grihastha, Shaunakoha Mahashalo, Angirasam Vidhivad Upapannaha, Shaunakoha Mahashalaha. Mahashala means somebody who is basically a family man who is having a small school of his own. Mahashala. He is having lot many students of his own. So he is obviously a Grihastha. He is a Grihastha who is having a wife, and then he is having lot many students and all that. So it is told to a Grihastha and not to Mahashalo Mahagrihastha, Shankaracharya writes. So it is not meant for monks only, it is meant for all household people like you and me who have wife, family, children, etc., etc. Okay. Then how is this Mundaka Upanishad structured? I will give a brief picture. This Mundakopanishad is in 3 parts. Each part is called a Mundaka. Prathama Mundaka, second Mundaka, Dvitiya Mundaka and Tritiya Mundaka, it is said. 3 parts. And each part has 2 sections again. So finally, it means totally there are 6 sections. 3 parts, each part having 2 sections. So that is the broad picture. And it is not a very big Upanishad. All said and done, there are about, I did not count, there may be about, say, 80 or 90, say, verses, 80 or 90 mantras. And at the very beginning, this Upanishad makes a very challenging statement. The challenging statement about the human knowledge. That is, we are very proud about our human knowledge of, say, physics, science, astronomy, zoology, so many things we are very proud of. But then all that is something which is external. And then we do not know our own internal, the nature of the observer itself we do not know. So that is why it makes a very challenging statement saying that what all knowledge which you have about the world is something which is of a lower nature. It is something subject to your own observation. Something subject to it is totally depending on your observation. But then the higher knowledge is something about yourself, about the real nature. That is what is called para. Para is higher and apara is lower. So this lower, the knowledge of the observer, the knowledge of the knower is of the higher order. And the knowledge of the external world, it is something, it may be huge volumes of all scientific texts, but then that is something which is dependent on the observer, so that is something which is lower. It is something which is dependent, isn't it? Anything which is dependent gets a lower status. So that is what it says. Then what is the supreme reality? The very first Mundaka defines that it is something which is something which is of nature of which is of the nature of infinity, and it is something which is nitya. Nitya is the same as satya, which is something which is existing always, and then which is sarvagataha, that is infinite, and then it is of the nature of intelligence. So all these things, say nityaha, sarvagataha, all those words, the very first say Mundaka uses all that. And then it also talks about the creation. Creation, while talking about creation, it says the creator, suppose you visualize a person called creator, and he has to do this creation. And what is the material for this creation? Suppose you think of a maker of a pot maker. A pot maker goes out and then goes to some say place and then gets some clay and then shapes that clay into a pot, isn't it? The pot maker is not clay. But here, if you say that this creator brought some material from outside, then we are saying that this creator is a limited personality. Creator is a limited personality. He has to secure some material from outside and he has to prepare say the whole world, etc. So which means we are saying that he is a limited thing. Also, he may be a very big person, but then still he is limited. It cannot be so. Where something which is limited, something which is dependent on some other, say, external material, it is something which is not ultimate, isn't it? So for both the things there will be something more, isn't it? Suppose there is a pot maker and a pot. Both the things are made by the creator, isn't it? So if there is a creator and the material for this whole universe, then it means that there is somebody who is above it also. So which means that the creator has to be the creation also. The creator has to be the creation. So in order to explain it, the Upanishad gives a few examples about how the creator, who is the so-called intelligent cause, is also the material cause. The intelligent cause and also the material cause, nimitta karana and also upadana karana, they are both one and the same. So that is what they say. So while after all this description about the nature of the Supreme and then how this creation takes place, the question comes, can we achieve it by karma? Can we know it by karma? Karma means any activity. Vedas, they also talk about various yajnas. Say some yajna for purpose of say rain, some other yajna for the purpose of some other personal prosperity. There are so many types of yajnas which are there meant for propitiating various deities, god forms. Can it be achieved by karma? The Upanishads very clearly say, whatever is achieved by karma is something which is ephemeral, which is time bound. It is only in relation to your karma. Your karma gives the proportionate amount of result. And then, depending on the limitedness of your karma, the nature of that result also is limited. So this is something, but realization is something which is a question of thinking. It is a question of contemplation. It cannot be achieved by karma. It can only be achieved by thinking. So that is why the Upanishad says, plava hyete. All these results of this karma, they are all fleeting in nature. Plava is the same as fly. They are all fleeting in nature. They fly away. Your whatever karma phala, it flies away. Then what to do? What is it where a seeker is supposed to do? He is supposed to examine. He is supposed to think, sit down and then think as to what is my karma and what is the karma phala. Is this karma phala, the result of karma, is it something which is eternal or is it ephemeral? What am I supposed to do? So he is supposed to think. So that is what is told in the mantra called Parikshya Lokan Karmachitan Brahmano Nirvedamayat. So you have to examine, you have to analyze all these lokas, that is 1-2-12. Anyway, I am just giving a summary only. So it says, you evaluate your actions, you evaluate your achievements, the result, karma phala or achievement. You evaluate your achievements and see their futility or the fleeting nature and then take a right decision, it says. And what is the right decision? You have to develop some equanimity. You have to develop equanimity and distance yourself from those things. So that is what it says. And how to do that? You can't do it alone. Somebody can help you better. You may be a very good runner, but then a coach is always there. Even for Olympic runners, there are some coaches. Olympic players, there are some coaches. So that sort of coach is a guru. And that guru is somebody who is already a realized person. He is also a realized person. And for guru, it gives what type of guru you should approach and with what frame of mind you have to approach. It says you have to go to a guru who knows the tradition and also who is a realized person. These two things why they have combined is, there may be a realized person who has not come through the tradition, but then he may not be a good teacher. He may not be able to coach you. He may be somebody who is smoking bhang or ganja or something like that, sitting in some cave, and you may or may not get knowledge from him, but ultimately you may end up smoking ganja. In fact, that is what my teacher used to say. If you don't go to a person who doesn't know the tradition, you may end up smoking ganja, you may or may not get knowledge. But here, you may or may not get knowledge, but at least you will be a disciplined person. Your discipline is intact. You will be a better person. Your mind is it becomes much purer, and then in his guidance, the mind is it becomes more mature. So that is why the teacher should be somebody who knows the tradition, who knows all the arguments or the dialectics, let us say. Without knowing the dialectics, he will not be able to explain to the student. Suppose the student questions, he should be able to explain, isn't it? So that is the nature. And the student also has to be prashanta chittaya shamanvitaya, he says. Somebody who has already achieved some shama, dhamma, etc. There are some prerequisites I was saying. That purity of mind is a prerequisite. Then again, what is it that the teacher says? Initially, the Upanishad itself has given the description of, what is the nature of Brahman. Now, through the teacher's mouth, teacher again says, what type of, reality is that, and how this entire universe has come about, what is this Maya, and then how this Prana, Manas, and all these things have come into existence. And then finally he says, and this thing can be realized in your own buddhi guha. Etadyo veda nihitam guhayam. That is 2-1-10, it says, the one who realizes this in his own buddhi guha. Buddhi guha is something, it is the intellect cave, we can call it. This image of a cave is something which we see in Plato also. In Western philosophy, in the whole Western philosophy, one ancient philosopher who thought about the mind was Plato. Later, nobody else thought about the mind. Later, everybody, his student Aristotle and all other people, they went about external world only. Only Plato thought about the observer. So anyway, Plato, you find that image of the cave, Plato's theory of cave, not theory, the idea of cave that you can see. So anyway, Buddhi Guha, why is it said it is realized in Buddhi Guha? Because this is the only tool a human being has, and it has to be realized through Buddhi only. This mind is the tool either for bondage with the external world, or for freedom. Mind is the tool either for bondage or for the freedom. So for freedom, if you are working, then you realize this supreme reality in your own Buddhi Guha. This is it. This is that supreme reality which is illumining me, which is illumining my concept, which is illumining my intellect. So that in every action of ours, we realize the reflection of that supreme reality. Like the examples given by modern teachers are that of an electrical bulb. The current may be flowing in a wire, but we don't see the current. It is only when it goes through a small filament, then it glows, and then it gives so much of light, and then there is electricity. Otherwise, electricity is not seen. So that is the way in which they describe. It is your mind is such a place It is such a sensitive thing which is able to receive the reflection of that supreme consciousness, it says. So because of that reflection, the mind is able to have so many, say, thoughts and then thinking, say, ability and whatnot. And then again it is able to have an idea of that supreme reality also. After all this discussion we are doing at the level of mind only. So all these things, they are all the reflection of that supreme reality only. So you have to realize it through your own mind, it says. Then what type of sadhana? What type of sadhana means what type of effort you have to make. The Upanishad also gives some efforts, like in the same second Mundaka, the second portion, the second khanda, it talks about pranavo dhanuhu, sharo hyatma. It again gives a description of pranava. Pranava is that Omkara. We will also discuss what is the significance of Omkara. In earlier Upanishads we discussed elaborately. What is the significance of Omkara? What is the greatness about this Om? We will discuss. And that Om should be your bow. And your Atma, your own self, your seeking, your inquiring self should be the arrow. And then when you shoot the arrow goes through the target. Of course, you should be a good shooter also. So it goes and joins the target. The sharavat tanmayo bhavet. The shara or arrow, it goes and goes through that lakshya or target. So like that, with this Om as your bow and your own mind as your own self as the arrow, you have to go, your self has to merge with the infinite self. So that is the point. Yourself, your so-called individual self has to merge with the infinite consciousness. The wave has to merge with the ocean. So that is what it says. Sharavat tanmayo bhaved. And for doing all that, you have to be dedicated. Anyavacho vimunchatha, it says. The Upanishad says, you have to forget about all those things. You forget about all this talk about films and all talk about politics and all talks about various other things. You forget about hating others. You forget about criticizing so many things. And then you concentrate on this. It is only then that the seeker can realize it. Otherwise he will be busy, abusing, one person, commending some other person, following a political, party. You will be doing all that. So it says, anya vacho vimunchatha, it says. And when this Brahman is realized, what is the result which you are getting? Vidyate hridaya granthihi, that is, all knots which are there in our intellect. Knots means all types of confusions, all types of questions, all types of riddles which are there in our minds. All those things, they are cut off, because all those things, they are product of our own ignorance. Due to our own ignorance, we are tying ourselves in knots and knots. And once that ignorance is destroyed, all those knots are also destroyed. This Vidyate Hridaya Granthi we saw in Kathopanishad also. So almost the same thing is repeated here. So all our own prejudices, our own dualities, our own hatred, love, etc., hatreds and likes, dislikes, etc., they all disappear. So this is one thing. And the Jnani stays in the awareness that Brahman is everywhere, Brahman is all around. And the ultimate result is, he loves all. He has got an unconditional love for all the people. I think we will continue there is some more, by way of summary. Just a little bit, we will continue in the next class. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vasishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti